Ciao, as we are having people say from all across the world. Welcome to our CORTH event. My name is Maya Unithan, and I'm Director of CORTH, the Center for Cultures of Reproductive Technologies and Health at the University of Sussex. I know we are having a lot of familiar faces, and I hope that my co-directors, Sophie, my co-directors, Haley McGregor from the IDS and Maria Moscati from the law school are also with us today. Hi, that's Haley. Please wave if you're here so people can see you. We are having an informal sort of session. It's called a meeting rather than a webinar, precisely because I think it's better to be able to see people and be able to see faces and meet with everyone. So thank you for joining us. I am going to introduce the speakers shortly, but before that, just to say, for those of you who are just coming in, please populate the chat box and tell us where you're from. I also would like to introduce our CORTH Center Administrator, Sophie Herford. Sophie, please wave to everyone. Thank you. Sophie is going to be monitoring the chat box and you know, has looking after all the sort of program details. We also have, we are recording this event, and this is going to be filmed, and we have our film producer, Andy, also here, who will be helping us produce a short film from this. So just to say, again, welcome, and now to introduce the speakers. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Paola Bergallo, our key speaker today. Paola is a law professor and researcher at the Universidad Torcuato de Tella in Buenos Aires. She holds, JSD and JSM degrees from Stanford Law School and an LLM from Columbia University and a BA with honors from the University of Buenos Aires. Over the last 15 years, Paola has been conducting research from a social-legal perspective, and there's really interesting work looking from that social-legal perspective at the intersection between gender and health and human rights, with a particular focus on abortion, law, and legal mobilization. Paola has led many action research projects funded, amongst others, by IDRC, the Norwegian Research Council, Banco Santander, and the Ford Foundation. But most importantly, I think, Paola has collaborated with civil society organizations and governmental leaders in the sort of huge campaigns for abortion law reform in Argentina and elsewhere. Paola has also held fellowships and visiting positions at different universities in the Americas and Europe. We are also at CORTH absolutely delighted and honored to have as our discussant Alicia Yamin. Alicia is a lecturer on law and a senior fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at the Harvard Law School, and is senior advisor on human rights at the Global Health Justice Organization, Partners in Health. Alicia is also currently research director at the Gender, Sexuality, and the Law Unit at the Center on Law and Social Transformation in Bergen, in Norway. Trained in both law and public health at Harvard, Yamin's 25 plus years career at the intersection of global health and human rights has bridged academia and activism, as well as law and global health and development. Yamin has published over 100 scholarly articles in law and peer-reviewed public health journals relating to health rights in international fora, in international publications, and comparative law. She's received multiple awards in recognition of her scholarly and advocacy work on sexual and reproductive health. Alicia regularly provides expert testimony and guidance to national and supranational tribunals and legislative bodies around the globe in relation to the application of international and constitutional law to health and sexual and reproductive, on health and sexual and reproductive rights issues. In relation to abortion in Latin America, since October 2020, Alicia has submitted what's called the amicus curiae briefs in the Causa Justa case in the Colombian Constitutional Court regarding abortion decriminalization in that country. And she has also, in 2018, testified in the Argentine Chamber of Deputies on the legalization of abortion. As a member of the advisory board of the Argentine Safe Abortion Access Network, REDAS, she has participated in multiple consultancies, consultations, and strategy sessions regarding law and health system reform since then. In January 2021, she was named on the oversight board of the Proyecto Mirar, a multi-stakeholder group examining implementation of the recently enacted abortion law. So we are in expert hands here, and I'm so looking forward to hearing, both our speakers and discussants. I'm going to hand over now to Alicia, who will first provide a short framing of the topic, after which we'll have the talk by Paola, followed by discussion points again raised by Alicia and general discussion. Thank you and welcome once again.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to be here and participate in the event with Paola on what I think is really an extraordinary milestone and what will be a very engaging and rich discussion. I want to introduce Paola in a slightly different way. I think I have had the great privilege of working with Paola and knowing her for almost 15 years now. And in addition to all of the accolades that Maya listed and being really one of the great experts on this law and on the legal processes, she is a consummate law and society scholar. And she looks at these historical processes, not just from a formal legal perspective, but in terms of the intertwined socio-historical evolutions, the public health, the advent of public health, discoveries and technologies. So I think she's absolutely the perfect person to help us understand how we should think about this momentous law legalizing abortion in the first trimester and doing a series of other things that Paola will detail later. It is, even for people who follow Argentine, this evolution in Argentina, it is a complicated story to unpack. And as there is a famous Argentine novel called Artificial Respiration, which starts with a quote that says, we had the experience, something like this, I'm thinking in the top of my head, we had the experience but missed the meaning. Approach to the meaning restores the experience, which is a quote from T.S. Eliot in turn. But I think that's what this meeting is about. And I think Paola is absolutely the perfect person to help us understand how we got to this place and what the implications are looking forward. So in that respect, I think she'll present a variety of different narratives for potentially understanding this law and the need to disentangle those different threads, right? Is this about the conquest of a specific service for sexual and reproductive health, abortion? Is it about women's equality, gender equality, and women's empowerment? Is it about a deepening of democracy in Argentina? And all of those are distinct narratives that we should understand and disentangle as they evolve and engage with differing and evolving configurations of actors and respond to forces, but also they are narratives that we have to understand ultimately intersect with one another, right? That our social worlds and our material worlds are actually not distinct, that this struggle for gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights always involves the need to emancipate women and persons who gestate from predefined social roles, and also the need for pragmatic progress in terms of over-the-counter access to misoprostol or different training of health providers. So I think we're going to hear some of that, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing how Paola tells those interrelated stories. Now, I want to just make one more introductory remark, which is in putting together a complicated historical narrative. Not all of you may be very familiar with the context of Argentina. So in and I think very correctly, and she'll go into this in more depth, Paola starts this story with the return to democracy in 1984, the transition from dictatorship. So in Argentina, for those of you who don't know this story well, the dictatorship in Argentina was the brutal imposition of law and order, very much also contained this idea that there was a natural order, right? A natural order based on Christian family values and patriarchal family values, and that women and women being in the family and women's sexual and reproductive roles were a part of that oppressive structure. And women in turn played a great role in the return to democracy, not just in the white kerchiefed mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, but in the advancement of the new constitution, in much more popular forums, in what are called comedores populares or food kitchens. Women played, not just in Argentina, across the southern cone of Latin America, but in Argentina, women played a very important role. And socio-historically, Catholicism and the role of the church has been important, but also diverse in Argentina. It's a very diverse country with differing degrees of the grip of the Catholic Church that has also evolved since the return to democracy. The second point, for those of you who don't know that much about Argentina, is that it is a federalist system. There is one criminal code, which is important to note. But the health system is, there are federal guidelines, but the provinces are in charge of implementing health services. And the third final thing that I'll quickly mention is that just as Argentina returned to democracy, just as the 1994 Constitution incorporated international human rights law through constitutional blocks, the encroaching neoliberal economic governance was also leading to the dismantling of the Keynesian state apparatus that was necessary for putting in place an infrastructure to provide health rights, including sexual and reproductive health rights. So with that framing, I'm going to turn it over to Paola, and I hope that in the discussion afterward, we can go deeper into some of these questions, as well as look forward from what are the questions we should be asking now after the law has been passed. So Paola, it's my great pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Maya, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you here at CORTH, at least in the web version of the meeting. It's also a pleasure to see the audience and the diversity of people interested in this experience. And so thank you to both of you for the generous presentations, and also thank you, Ali, for introducing part of the context in which I'm going to locate my presentation. I'm going to share with you a presentation so that you can follow part of the history that Ali told you. as she mentioned, it's a complicated story. I am proposing to organize the talk, first of all, introducing the different narratives that you can look at to trace the story of the achievement that we reached last December with the new law regulating abortion in Argentina. And I'm going to show you some possible timelines where you can trace some of the main facts and moments in the Argentine history to understand the different narratives that you could follow to think about abortion and the different moments of the mobilization that the women and the feminist movement have produced over the last 30 something, almost 40 years. I'm also going to focus a little bit on the new law and a basic reference to its content. And then I'm going to propose you some of the main factors in feminist organization regarding the framings, the forms, and the strategies. And if there's further time during the discussion, we can discuss a little bit more about legal mobilization and lawyers' role, which is part of the focus I have had in my prior research. And also we can discuss about the future and the challenges for the law and for the larger process of women empowerment and democratization that I think is part of the story that I'm going to share with you. So, as I said, I think that we can reconstruct the history of the last 40 years in different levels. And of course, for me, the whole story is basically a story of the experience of women and other identities and its role and its building the democratization process of Argentina. So in a way, this is a larger history about how women, feminists, and other groups, including the LGBT movement, get to have a stronger role in shaping Argentine future and Argentine democracy. Of course, there is a history of women empowerment that is interlinked to the empowerment of other groups, among them the diversity community. And there is another narrative that sometimes is the one that is more discussed, which is the history of the reform of abortion law and all the battles and the mobilization and counter-mobilization that we feminists and the women's movement in Argentina went through in the last 30 years, focusing on the fight for the law that we finally achieved last December. So this is a short timeline of the two versions of the story that I said are part of the history. The version that has to do with the main facts connecting the process of democratization with women participation and women empowerment in the political arena and also in the social sphere. And we can go back to before 1983, where the women's movement started in Argentina, and also where the feminist organizations began to mobilize. But I will start with 1983, December 1983, and the whole year when the process of returning to democracy and holding elections was seen and is still seen as the beginning of a new era for Argentine history. So if we go back to that point, you always will have in mind the prior organization and the prior demands of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, who are like part of the building block of the women's rights movement in Argentina. And this is, of course, the history also of the human rights movement, which is a very important strand of mobilization and a strand where women have participated in different roles. It started with the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, but then shaping different places of the organizations until today. The other beginning point is the election of 1993 that took President Alfonsín to power and started the democratic transition, which has been studied and periodicized in different ways. I still think that we are living that transition until today, not only from the perspective of women and all the achievements that I will show you that have taken us 40 years, but also from many other perspectives. We are just celebrating in a way the reconstruction of the political system with two competitive coalitions, which was one of the main challenges to organize from an electoral and political perspective the political structure of our democracy. So we started with that election that took the Radical Party to power. And since then, we began a process of dealing with the past that you probably heard about, which is a study in different places. We have a truth commission, trials of the heads of the juntas. We went back and forwards during the last 30 years in dealing with the past violations of human rights during the prior dictatorship and also prior dictatorships that anteceded the last and more violent one. And it started in the late 90s with a new era. We began to see the approval of laws that mark at least a first stage in the conquest of some very basic rights. The first law that I want to bring here is the 1990 HIV law, which was also a pioneer law in terms of mandating coverage of treatment for HIV and AIDS patients at the time, even before the retrovirus were discovered. So this was a very important law in terms of health rights and the recognition of diversity, which was pioneer in the early 1990s. The following year, we also have a very, very important law that was part of the result of the advocacy of high-profile politicians, both within the two main parties at the time, the Peronist and the Radical parties, and mostly by women who were asking for the development of an affirmative action policy to participate in the electoral system. So in 1991, we also had another very pioneer law, which is the quota law, mandating that women will have access to 30% of the positions being submitted to elections every year for the National Congress. And then the approval of these laws spearheaded the approval of provincial laws mandating quotas for the provincial political systems too. And this, as you probably heard, is the first law in the world to provide for that set of affirmative action policies for participating into the political and the electoral system. And I think it's in the heart of what we have seen in the recent years, the possibility of having the leadership in the women organized in the political parties that we've seen in the last 5 years, especially, and the fact that Argentine women have reached the presidency and the main governorship of the main provinces of Argentina, or the main province of Argentina, is in part, in a very significant part, a result of this pioneer moment in Argentine politics and the inclusion of women. Then in 1994, we also had a reform of the Argentine constitution that was very important because it brought the constitutional protection of the quota law, which was being discussed in the courts, of course, and it was being disputed. And this brought to the Constitution a special article providing for the constitutionality of the affirmative action in the electoral system. But also, this was a very important moment because the Constitution introduced a number of human rights treaties that were incorporated into the Constitution and in a way reshaped the foundations of Argentine law. So that's also another very important moment. At the same time that Argentina was embracing also the Inter-American human rights system, and that year in particular, the country was signing the Belém do Pará Convention, which is, as you probably know, the convention of the region that deals with violence against women and equality for women. So if you go back to these moments, you see very foundational points in the history that led to the successes and the achievements in terms of formal law, basically, that we have reached in the following decades. Behind all these processes, I want to mention, of course, the human rights movement that was being organized and developed and growing and getting the strength of its more developed organizations. And it was also another process that was very important in terms of mobilization, that was the emergence of the annual meetings of the women movement that are known as the Encuentros Nacionales de Mujeres, that had been celebrated on an annual basis almost for 37 years in the last 4 decades. So that's also part of a very important point in terms of the organizing behind the process. And then you probably also heard about 2001 and 2002, when the country reached a very, very difficult crisis in terms of its political organization, the social condition of our people, and also the political crisis that led us to have 5 presidents in 10 days, and also to finish to an early finish of the mandate of President de la Rúa in December 2002. So that was a very difficult, terrible moment in our history, the most traumatic one probably after the democratic breakdowns, in which all the problems that we have in the economic, the social, and the political sphere converged to produce an awful crisis that probably changed my generation and all those who were adults at that point, showing us in Argentina that many people had been denying, that had been going through a process of reversal of development for, at the time, for decades, a process that in a way still continues, since the country has had 70 years without growing its economy and without resolving many of its social and political conflicts. So, and then we started a process of reorganization of the political sphere, the social mobilizations behind the women's and other groups. And we see a change that has produced over the last 20 years several important milestones in terms of laws that relate to women's empowerment and other aspects of women history in Argentina. One important milestone in that history is the achievement of the first woman to be president of the country. That presidency also produced, in a way, the approval of 2 very important laws in terms of the structure of sex equality and sexual rights. First, in 2010, the same-sex marriage law, and then in 2012, the identity law, which, as you probably know, is also one of the pioneers laws in terms of the extent, the definition of self-recognition, of identity as the structuring principle, and also because of what it mandates in terms of government coverage of the social rights dimension of the identity debates. And finally, we see the women of Argentina reaching another level of their capacity to organize with the Ni Una Menos movement that you also probably heard about in 2015, when women and men and people from all different groups and identities populated the streets of Buenos Aires and several of the biggest cities of Argentina, claiming the Ni Una Menos demand, which means a strong demand for the detention of violence against women, and especially femicides, which had been followed, but also reaching numbers that were not seen in the past. It's not that they were not there, they were not actually seen in the past. So the recognition of the gender violence that was prevalent in the country led also to the organization of this very important streets movement and social organizing. And that year also coincided with new elections, where a new party and coalition got to power, a coalition that was finally going to complete a 4-year mandate, breaking a historical challenge, because since the 1920s, there had not been other coalition different from the Peronist party, able to finish a complete constitutional mandate for a president. So that's a very important point also in terms of the history, because we started to have some alternation in terms of the coalitions or the parties ruling the country. And that year we have the first governors of the province of Buenos Aires, which is the main provincial district that house almost 35% of the population of the whole country. So this was the first time in which a woman finally led that role. And a very important also antecedent of the whole process that in a way accelerated in the last 2 years, reaching the possibility of the law in 2020, is also the parity law that was approved in 2017, where women from different parties made an agreement and were able to pass a law mandating 50% of the seats in each list in the electoral process for women. So that's a very important shift from the old 1991 quota law to the parity system, which demands 50-50 participation of women and men in the electoral process. And finally, we see the 2018 debate on abortion, which is in a way the political event where finally abortion has reached the democratic arena as it had not been able to do before. I'm gonna move to the next slide, where I want to offer you a timeline that is more focused on the abortion debate that of course ends in 2020 with the law. But in terms of the political transformation, I think that 2018 is really the stage when the escalation of the conversation and the debates within the federal Congress and in the public sphere and in the private life of Argentinians really made a huge difference. So if we go back to the conversation of on abortion, we can see very few people talking about abortion in the first years of the transition from 1983 to 1990. The main challenges were to pass a divorce law, to pass a law sharing parental rights between men and women, which until then had been exclusively reserved for men in the civil code. So the main fights of the early transition were about reforming the basic regulation of family, dealing with divorce, and the children's rights in terms of parental regulations. So, and in the 1990s, we start to see a phenomenon that reaches some of the courts at the provincial or the federal level. And we see, it's not showing, several conservative groups are starting to litigate against access to contraception, access to tubal ligations, different cases also in which some women victims of rape are asking for legal abortions. And in these cases, we see a very conservative judiciary propelled by a conservative legal set of groups that are litigating against sexual and reproductive rights. In 1994, the reform of the Constitution, it's a moment in which some conservative actors pushed forward to introduce a clause protecting life since conception, and feminists organized to impede that advance, but they are not able to fight for the recognition of stronger reproductive rights in the Constitution. So what we all celebrated in 1994 was that the Constitution didn't incorporate a protection of the life since conception, as it had been the case in some other transitions in Latin America. So that was the scene in most of the 1990s. In 1996, a bill was approved in the House providing for a national program to provide access to contraceptives, and the bill was defeated in the Senate. So in 1996, speaking of reproductive rights in Argentina meant speaking about access to contraceptive, and there was not a consensus on the duty to provide access to contraception to poor sections of the population, because there was not a consensus on the legality and the constitutionality of the hormonal contraceptives. So that was where we were in 1996. We have to move forward to some years later when we start to see the growth of the organization of small groups of women fighting for abortion law reform. And here you have just one of the images of the groups that pioneer the claim for an abortion law reform, which was formed in the late 80s. That was the Comisión por el Aborto. And, but the successes were all for those against the recognition of regular reproductive rights and abortion regulation in particular. And we reached 2002, and in the middle of that crisis that I described to you, finally the agreement is reached, and we have a law that is passed mandating the executive government to create a program to offer contraceptives and counseling on contraceptives and very basic reproductive health counseling. So in 2002, also 18 years ago, reproductive rights were only about giving information and access to contraceptives in the countries. The enforcement of that law was a fight in itself. The law was litigated against in the courts. We had to fight for its constitutionality. And finally, 40 years after the law was passed, the government did the initial appropriation of funds to develop that program. Between 2002 and 2005, the National Program of Reproductive Health didn't have local funds to provide access to contraception to the poorer people of our population. 2006, we start to see the approval of different laws. In 2006, we see the passage of a sex education law, another battle in terms of enforcement until today. And in between 2003 and 2007, we see the development of a very important organization in the women's movement and the feminists of Argentina, which is the creation of the National Campaign for a Legal, Safe and Free Abortion, la Campaña Nacional por el Aborto Legal, Seguro y Gratuito, that started in 2003 in one of the national encounters of the women's movement, and in 2007 files its first draft of a bill to legalize abortion. And since then, until 2019, the campaign has been filing every 2 years bills with the support of members of the House, that of course was the support that was increasing. Every 2 years, the campaign filed bills for the legalization of abortion. Of course, the campaign grew exponentially after the 2015, and it grew increasingly every year since 2003 until its last mobilization that you probably saw in the streets of Buenos Aires or in the pictures about the mobilization. In 2012, we have a very important Supreme Court decision that finally established the constitutionality of the model of indications that Argentina had had in its written criminal code since 1921. And this is a very important intervention of the Supreme Court, the first Supreme Court to have 2 women justices that had, in different dimensions, cooperated with the gender agenda in terms of working to fight gender violence, or in terms of promoting the presence of women and a gender perspective in the judiciary. In 2015, you already heard about what the movement was doing in the streets, but it's important to also acknowledge that 2 days after the big first demonstration of the Ni Una Menos movement, the National Ministry of Health issued the first official version of an abortion guideline that had been fought for in the executive, in the context of the health department for several years, and had produced some frustrated editions of other versions of the guidelines. So finally, we are in 2015, and we have the court, the Supreme Court, participating in the conversation, the Ministry of Health issuing regulations on legal abortions, which were the abortions provided for in case of risk for the life, the health, and in case of rape. And since 1921 until 2015, we have finally reached an agreement that Argentina had a pretty liberal regulation of abortion, actually similar to the one that you have in the UK, with indications providing for really liberal cases in which you could have abortions, as I said, in case of risk for the life and the health of a woman, and in case of rape. So, but this was, of course, a legal fight that we fought in different settings, and we could go deeper. Then we have the parity law, and the parity law is here not because of the change in the regulation of the electoral system, but because the articulation of women that was able to produce the passage of this law was key the following year in order to push for the debate on abortion, in order to push the President Macri and the heads of the House and the Senate to invite the opening of the conversation. So the experience, the experience of multi-party, sectoral organization that produced the parity law is in part what explains the capacity of the politicians that led the push to the president and the heads of the House and the Senate to open the debate in 2019. So this history is a history of the combination of a lot of organization in the streets, a lot of work in the more bureaucratic side of the organizational dimension of the women's movement, as I will explain, and also the work of this generation of new feminist politicians that were occupying seats in Congress that led them to organize the agreement that pushed for the parity law, and the following year for the opening, the following 3 months, actually, because the law was passed in the last session of 2017, and the debate was started in the first sessions of 2018. And this is a very important issue, because I think that sometimes, because of the pictures and the images that circulate around the world, we tend to underestimate the role of having finally a new generation of feminist politicians leading politics within Congress. That was part of what made possible the convergence of all the mobilization in the streets, in the offices, and in the professions, in order to also lead to this huge debate. And this is a picture of some of the of the main politicians from very different sectors and areas of the two coalitions disputing political power in Argentina since 2015. And this is also another very important moment in the history of women's rights and of the abortion right debate, which is the electoral process of 2019, which was the first one in history where presidential candidates have a discourse, an opinion, and promises regarding abortion. And the main role that the abortion debate occupy in this process led the candidate at the time to the presidency, Alberto Fernandez, to promise to file a bill pushing the debate forward. And this was an electoral promise that the president finally executed last November, when the presidency, the legal advisor to the presidency with the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversities filed the bill in Congress that was finally passed and in 2020. So again, during the pandemic, we saw the women in the streets, all the organization of the campaign, and also the more spontaneous mobilization of women across the country, but also a political process in this year led by the commitment of the electoral process by the elected president and his cabinet. So I think that this is also a very important process that connects and interlinks, as Ali was saying, the different narratives. The narratives about like our mobilization on abortion rights, which has been also a work of 4 decades almost. Of course, there are women who began earlier, even before the last dictatorship, but it's been a consistent work since we started this democratic era. It's also the history of women's empowerment in the streets, also in the different places where professional women and women have their public life, and also its connection with other movements as the diversity movements, the sex diversity movements, but also the disability movements, the human rights movements, etc. And it's also the history of democracy and how this narrative interlinks, finally getting the head of the executive pushing forward for this law, which symbolically means recognizing, I think, full equality for women and other identities. And so this is just a selection of pictures of this last year. The first is a picture of the president. When a book was presented, and this was a book narrating the story of one of the also very important legal cases that propelled the conversation, the Belén case. Belén was a woman who spent 2 years of her life in jail because of allegedly an illegal abortion. And so the histories of women that had been going to jail for illegal abortions had been very important in different moments of the advocacy of the women's movement. And this is just a picture that shows how the legal work in the courts, in the movement, also in narrating the history and in reaching the political leaders, converge in 1929 in the electoral process. Then you see the beginning of last year parliamentary process where the president ratified his commitment to send a bill. And then you see the pictures of the day the bill was filed with Congress by the legal advisor to the president, the Ministry of Women Affairs, and the Ministry of Health. So this was the executive government with the main representatives of its cabinet, both in terms of equality and social rights in the dimension of health, committing to start a new debate with a very different political framing. We also have the streets, and we have the House and the Senate pass the law. And a very important last moment, which is the promulgation of the law, when the president signed the law, also accompanied by the chief of cabinet, the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Women and Gender. And I think that all these symbols and all these pictures are very important because they underline the claim that this is about women and democracy and diversity, the diversity, the community and democracy, and how we reach a point in our history when we have a different commitment to the inclusion of women in public and private life. So that's basically the narrative with the main historical points. Some basic ideas about the law. So the law provides for abortion on demand until the 14th week. Afterwards, it provides for a set of indications in case of risk for the life, the health, and of the woman or gestational person in gestation. And also it provides for a rape exception. All these indications are accessible after the 15th week of pregnancy. The law provides for the free coverage of the abortion services in the public health system, and it also has some regulations regarding the private health system. It establishes the standards for the provinces that will then have to apply, and eventually in some cases regulate some of the application of these mandates. It also regulates conscientious objection in a transaction recognizing the rights of objectors, but it doesn't say anything about the prohibition of the institutional objection. That was something that the prior bill included. It also provides for the right of women and persons with other gestational, with other gender identities with gestational capacities. So the subject of the law is defined in broader terms, like reaching out the diversity also of identities. It regulates consent, some aspects of adolescents' rights and people with disabilities. And it's accompanied, the law was also filed with another law that is called the 1000 Days Law that regulates different social services and social provisions for women and other people with in a pregnancy situation regarding like social, the coverage of pregnancy services and economic transfers and money transfer for pregnant people. So this is also a very important law in terms of the social rights dimension of the pregnancy experience. Also, it's an important law because it reframed, in a way, the bill as a social project, also trying to help women and other people to sustain their pregnancy if that was their option. So it's a package of two laws that together frame this as an individual and also like a traditional autonomy demand, but also as public health and a social issue. And I think that's a very important difference in terms of how the government offered the framing, because this second law was also passed by an unanimous consent in the Senate. And this is also very important in terms of pushing for the agreement and the negotiation of the law. So something about the organizational frames. I could present you some of the organizational frames used on the abortion debate, which of course included the public health dimension, the human rights, the autonomy, the egalitarian claim made by women and other identities, etc. But I would prefer to focus on the main frames used by the women's movement and the feminist movement to organize their history of claims, because I think that this is more interesting in terms of the democratic and the women empowerment narrative. This is 40 years of fighting for like the four main agendas of the Beijing project, which were the gender violence dimension, the sexual and reproductive rights dimension, the political equality or the inclusion in decision-making, and the economic equality. And this chart shows you how in these four dimensions, women have battled within the courts, the Congress, and the executive branch to obtain laws regulating different aspects of gender violence, political equality, and sexual and reproductive rights. In the economic equality arena or the economic security arena, it's clearly that we still have a lot to do. In terms of the other three agendas, I think that the challenge is more about enforcement and homogeneous enforcement in the federal reality of Argentina. But in terms of the economic equality agenda, it's clear that there is where our main challenges lie ahead. Also, in the green box, you see some of the mainstreaming strategies in terms of the framing that Argentine women have used, which include a strong commitment to international human rights framings and international human rights provisions because of the role that these treaties occupied in the 1994 Constitution, but also because of the transnational dimension of the human rights movement that has been very important for Argentine history. So in our battle in terms of the framings that had something to do with the law and the definition of women's rights, the CEDAW Convention, the Belén do Pará Convention, and also the articles of the Constitution that deal with the human rights treaties, the constitutional dimension of the quota of the affirmative action for politics are very important sources of that organization. And of course, the important reform that the Argentine Civil Code has undergone, it's also part of another change that is relevant to the history of the civil regulation of women's rights within the family and in the private arena. And there is also an important reference to the reforms that have been introduced in the criminal code that are mostly dealing with with gender violence. So in terms of the structures or the strategies of organizations, I think that we are all expecting good empirical sociological studies of the women's movement and its recent transformations. And I think that those who have conducted studies, I have done some of the work, and also I have my own practical experience in working with the organizations of the women movement, we recognize that we have a combination of very strong and increasingly developed bureaucratic organizations. I'm using Mayra Marx-Ferri's distinction between, and other sociologists of the women's movement, distinction between those organizations that are more organized, that have structures, staff, professional, elite organizations, another way to say it, and collective organizations, more informal, or organizations with less developed structures, governance, with less resources, but a lot of volunteering work. And the history of the Argentine movement is a combination, of course, of a great number of these organizations at the federal and the provincial level, and an increasing number of these organizations. It's of course also the result of professional feminists, an increased generation of professional feminists, of state feminists, or femocrats, as this literature call them. But it's also the history of a lot of pro bono work by middle classes, organized with different levels of sophistication, and a lot of coalition building and networks. There is still a lack of a systematic study of the new generation of these organizations, and I think that many of you might be interested in looking at this organizational dimension, which has been in a way unexplored yet. And people ask, what did the Argentines do? How did they do it, etc.? I think that it's because we haven't studied it from an empirical and a sociological or an anthropological perspective enough. And this is going to be, I'm sure this is going to be studied in the next years. And in terms of the qualities or the characteristics of these different ways of organizing, a very important and something that I think differentiates part of the organization of the Argentine movement with other organizations or movements in Latin America. As a federal country, Argentina is a very heterogeneous society or set of societies, that the women's movement has been very federal. The National Campaign for Abortion, the National Encounters of Women have always been federal. They have circulated every year around different cities of Argentina. They have avoided Buenos Aires as a core site of meetings. And I think that's a very important history. And it's also part of the huge work done by feminists from all places of Argentina, and in many cases from outside Buenos Aires, who had been the leaders of the movement. So also another important thing, it has a lot of territorial work, which means I'm using this word to refer to the work, the basic work done by organizations in the streets, in the places where the poor sectors of our country live, in the poor communities. And this work, it has been developed in the last decades with a very strong presence of feminists who have worked in popular neighborhoods, in organizing different types of groups of women, etc. It's also intergenerational. It finally has different layers of women coming from different generations with different experience. And of course, the streets of Buenos Aires and of the big cities has been mobilized as we have mobilized them in the last couple of years because of the presence of adolescents and young women who have embraced feminisms in proportions and in ways and with commitments that were not present before in the history of my generation or the former generations, or those who preceded me and my friends and colleagues. It also has a very important component of professional organizing. That sometimes is, that's a type of organization that is known for certain observers of the process, but we have networks of social workers that have been providing access to medical abortion and doing amazing work, connected or unconnected to the national campaign. We have also networks of teachers that have been working in the enforcement of the sex education law, training teachers, training adolescents, etc. So it's replacing the work that the education system was not doing for years. We have networks of health professionals, as the one that Ali mentioned, but also other networks that had been organized to provide access to abortion and other reproductive health issues. And we also have networks of lawyers and other collectives that have done professional work have become more professionalized in the process and have started to work and organize in different ways since 2019. Now we have collectives of architects, women working in board directors, in the chemical industry, in the engineering, in STEM, etc. All these groups are organized by categories of professions or artistic vocations, etc. And this process of a lot of work and organizing is also possible because Argentina still has the culture of a middle class. It doesn't have the statistics and the social demographics of a country with a strong middle class as it used to be, but still has the culture of the middle class. And many of the women organizing and doing pro bono work and participating, etc., when we think on the older generations that have other demands, you will see there are middle class women that are able to cope with this new empowerment and their public role, etc. It's also a place where we have important other social movements. I refer to those that have always been allies and very important in helping the women's movement, at the LGBT movement, and but also we have strong social organizations that were strengthened after the 2002 crisis and got embedded in the state and the different levels of the state. So these are also very strong organizations where women have participated in great numbers, and where in the last decades they have started to reach leadership positions. And this is also a change in terms of the traditional social movements that have this horizontal type of organization. And we also have lots of of young people in the social networks, and the Ni Una Menos experience, and also follow-up processes, the Mira Cómo Nos Ponemos, which is our version of the Me Too movement, and the civic follow-up of the 2018 debate, where people will count the votes, will follow the ideas and the speeches of all the representatives in the House and the Congress, etc., was also possible because of all the social networking online, but also in different ways of organizing. And as I also said, we have a multi-party and a polyclassist, is another way to organization of women in politics that has been part of what explains the shift in the political arena. And we have been very, very privileged to come with a lot of transnational support from colleagues, organizations, funders that have cooperated with the Argentine movement and that have transferred us knowledge, opportunities to learn about what was happening around the world, in other countries, in other fights. And this is also a very important component of Argentine cosmopolitanism. And I think that in different ways, that's also been present in all what has happened, that we have counted with a lot of support from the international women's movement and different organizations and different communities in the world, and especially from Latin America. Well, the strategies, I think I have already mentioned most of them. We have done a little bit of everything. And I think that the different groups and the different identities that I have mentioned have had their expertises. And after you see the timelines, you can see that we have used everything that was available in terms of advocacy and modern mobilization. So I won't refer to the list. It's there for you to see in case you want to peer it. And so I think that I could end here. I've taken a little bit more of the time of the half an hour. And I'd rather leave the time for discussion, questions, and also we can zoom in more legal aspects of the fight, or on my perspective, which is a humble perspective of what lies ahead. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Paola. And I think as I previewed, Paola just has an extraordinary grasp on so many different angles of these different intertwined stories. I also think it was very clear from what she said that this is messy, right? Often I work a lot at the international level, and often we talk about so-called human rights-based approaches to health or to sexual and reproductive health. And there is kind of this, I guess to some people, seductive idea that in international law, there is a progressive elaboration of norms and standards, and then those are somehow applied at national level. And in fact, we see from the Argentine experience that it is vastly more complicated than that, that the notion of implementing human rights or sexual and reproductive rights through global governance is hollow at best and deeply problematic or cynical at worst. And also the idea that you can separate legal mobilization and juridification from social mobilization is also somewhat problematic. So I think the complexity and the granularity that Paola presented shows that to recognize rights and to make them real in services, to have them animate the way that women and other and diverse people of different sexualities act in society is a much more complex and multidimensional project. So I have a couple of questions, Paola, looking back at the talk and then moving forward, which I think I'm just going to take the privilege of being the discussant before we open it up to broader questions. The first question is a pretty specific one about, you named all of these different actors involved, professionals and different kinds of movements. And that is the case in other countries too, but there's often a lot of conflict, right? A lot of conflict between the women's rights movement and the traditional mainstream human rights movement, a lot of conflict between the mainstream, even pro-choice people within the health system, doctors and providers and nurses, and the what are called socorristas in Argentina, the hotline operators. So what explains kind of the ability to work across those groups in this process?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ali, for the question. I think that there has been a lot of conflict. I don't want to understate it, but I think that probably because of the larger narrative that I mentioned is the broader narrative in which you locate the history the different histories that I told you. The narrative is a narrative of 70 years of underdevelopment or reversal of development of a country that has not been able to grow that has today the same GDP of 1974. That in 1974 had the Gini of England, and some years ago we had the Gini of Brazil. So it's really with Russia, the two countries that you see in the World Bank map of the two countries that have undergone development, the only two countries in the world. And we are like the second country in the world with the higher inflation, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to give you these records. And I think that more consciously, less consciously, that has been behind the mind of all the women organizing, that there were no other chances, that we have to work together or there was no future for us, for our kids, for our friends, and for the country. And I think that that's part of what I feel it's in the backyard in the possibility of all this collaboration, that it's not that often the case in other places. It was not easy for Argentines to cooperate either, and it's not easy now either. But I think that there were no other opportunities, or there were no other alternatives. And at the same time, I think that the collaboration between this new generation of women politicians is very important, because they really represent a lot of people. These are the women representatives of the main provinces of the country who have gone through the political process, and they really feel that they represent many people. So they have the legitimacy to negotiate and to cooperate, representing also a lot of people. So I think that having this political scenario in which we have finally two coalitions competing between themselves to alternate themselves in power, which is a very basic condition for a democratic process, and having women located in key positions in those two coalitions is very important for this agenda too. I don't want to underestimate the role of having political leaders. And of course, the role of having two presidents that in different ways, they have not been afraid to open this conversation and finally to challenge the Catholic Church, which is the big actor missing in this presentation, of course.
So actually that goes, I want to ask you one more question about getting to where we are before I look forward. And it's really about COVID. Because in 2018, as you described, there was this transformative moment of bringing abortion out into the streets beyond debates in legal institutions, really into popular consciousness, far more broadly than it had been before, even to school children, to really across the country. And then, you know, COVID struck. There was a lot of work subsequent to that, the narrow misvote in the Senate, but then COVID struck. And there was at that point some question about whether to push forward with law reform or not, to take other strategic directions. And you talked about how the women's movement did not let up during the pandemic, and we saw the organizing continue. But do you think, and President Alberto Fernandez obviously came out in support, but do you think that it also weakened the opposition in some ways not to be able to mobilize during the pandemic in the same way they might have had the pandemic not occurred? Or how do you see that? Because we've seen a lot of practice innovations around abortion and sexual and reproductive health around the world during COVID. So how do you see that influencing the situation?
So it's too early, and I haven't conducted research to answer you like seriously. I don't know if the opposition was weakened by the pandemic. We've seen conservative groups go into the streets to oppose the quarantine, and those in a way overlapped with those opposing the abortion law reform. Many Argentinians went to the streets in different moments of the last year to demonstrate against the government too. I don't know if that was the case. I think that the difference was that there was a political leadership, a very strong political commitment. So, and also the legitimacy of having had the point made throughout the electoral process meant that during 1929, the election that reached to the 46, almost 47% of the votes that went to Alberto Fernandez legitimized the president decision. So this was a very important difference with the 2018 debate. The 2018 debate was pushed forward by these female politicians, and also the president said, Macri said, okay, let's open the debate, but he wasn't committed. He hadn't heard all the things that were said in Congress, etc. Alberto Fernandez, in a way, put the issue on the election, and he won. So that's also a very important thing in terms of the democratic legitimacy of the decision to send the bill. And it might have been simpler, but it was also very simple to pass the same-sex marriage law in a frame of uncertainty. So I think that it's hard to tell, but I don't think it's because the antis were absent. Also because I don't think that the antis today are a significant majority. I think that they are a minority that can speak very loud and that has economic support and in 2019 had the funds to do a very good communication campaign. But I don't think that the majority of the Argentinians when they think about abortion, they think that women should go to jail. Yeah. And I think that the polls kind of say that too.
Okay. Now, I was just thinking of how much more reduced the debates in Congress were, and it was over Christmas time, et cetera. But so I have two questions moving forward. One is about Argentina. You and I have worked on health rights in Argentina, and we know that there are significant regulatory and compliance gaps in all areas of the health system. What do you see as steps and challenges moving from this law, and now there's been some regulation, but to really creating effective public policy and moving it into programs and making it real for people who gestate?
Okay, so just one clarification about the length of the debate in December that you were mentioning. I think that was a political decision and an agreement among everybody. Also because in 2018, we have 700 people going to the hearings and to give their opinion, expertise, information, knowledge in the House, and 150 in the Senate. So nobody thought that there was a need of more of that information, also because the presentations are recorded, so you could replay them. So it was hard to say something new. Actually, there was very little new information produced from 2018 to 2020. So I think that was part of something that was reasonable, and nobody expected a new long debate as the prior one. In terms of the enforcement and the challenges, I think that the fact that the Ministry of Health and the new Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversities are part of the process that legitimated the approval of the law and are now in charge of the enforcement is something very important, because these are high-profile cabinet members with their structures put at the service of enforcement, and they had already been working on enforcing the legal abortion that was already in the criminal code before the new law. So there was a very strong and incremental implementation process for the model of indications that now has to follow up and get larger, etc., for the new law. That from the federal level. But of course, as you said, that's nothing when we know that the local provinces are the responsible for enforcing the law. And in that situation, I think that it will vary very much between different sides of among different sides of the country and among different provinces and within provinces. The heterogeneity of Argentine federalism is a reality for all the human rights that we have recognized in the constitutions and in laws, and it's a huge challenge. And of course, we're going to see like the green provinces that will move very fast ahead. They are even producing misoprostol. Lots of medical abortions have been done with online support, etc. And there will be the provinces that have resisted the law and will resist enforcement. One thing that I believe is that because the symbolic dimensions of the history that I have told you are more important than the obsession with the regulation of abortion, we should be careful of like following the US model and focusing all our feminist capacities in the enforcement of this law. I really think that we need to move to the broader picture, and especially to move to the economic security part of the chart, where all the stronger challenges lie ahead, because we want to make women independent or autonomous just with the provision of access to abortion if we don't have access to very basic economic survival conditions.
Yes, I think I fully support a reproductive justice approach as opposed to the US path. I want to pick up on actually a question in the chat that goes very much to the last question I was going to ask you, which is about the regional implications. Somebody from Bolivia said this in the chat, but you know, the matrimonial, in English, same-sex marriage law had enormous effects throughout the region, and the green wave is already having enormous impacts across the region. So what do you foresee there, and what have been the connections with women's movements in different countries, and the, as you pointed out, the very well-articulated transnational feminist movements as well across Latin America?
Well, I hope the influence is relevant. I am not sure if the Argentine organizations and the people who led this experience is prepared or has the resources to do this work, to share our experiences, etc. Like, for different reasons, I think that, and also in contradiction to all this individual cosmopolitanism that you see in some Argentinians and in many from the capital cities of the country, at the same time, Argentinians and Argentine women have not been very present in the regional leadership of the movement. Our organizations have not been present there. It might be a lack of resources. And it also is a bit of a lack of vision of what we can contribute, and also is part of a history of the stereotypes that the region has with Argentines in general, and maybe with women too. Though we are not the same as the guys that build up the stereotypes, and we are more modest, I think. Argentina has this history of having been a very bad leader of the region, so that's also probably behind the story.
So I want to go to another question in the chat now about intergenerational and intersectional identities, and how, if you could talk a little bit more specifically about how support was garnered in different across younger generational groups, and also with men and LGBTI populations and heterosexual men.
Well, first of all, the LGBT movement has also always been quite strong for other movements or for the movement in other places of Latin America. That's why I put the 1990 HIV law there, because it showed something about that like during the AIDS and the AIDS pandemic, the local organizations were quite strong and had their presence in also the human rights movement, or their connection to the human rights movement, and their presence in the democratic transition. That's one thing. And also I have a hypothesis there also that Argentina was a big beneficiary of the AIDS fund. You know that, the Global Fund for AIDS in the late 90s and early 2000. And this is an exception, because we have never been a target of big international funding. But the AIDS, the Global Fund for AIDS pulled a lot of funds to Argentina, and that helped a lot to develop the LGBT organization. So we have, in a way, we have a stronger and earlier, stronger LGBT organizations organized from an earlier point than the women's organizations that we have. Someone should compare this and should trace this, but that's, in my research, that's what I have seen when I researched the HIV litigation, etc. I found people who had been organized and funded in ways in Buenos Aires that had not been in the women's movement. Also, a lot of money of the Global Fund for AIDS went to the University of Buenos Aires, and that's where also an important group of academics developed important contributions to that agenda. So there were, in the political science department of the University of Buenos Aires, there was a group working on sex and gender that had a stronger sex diversity agenda than a gender agenda 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and that's also something. And so that's one point, I think. And as they reached the same-sex marriage law and the identity, the gender identity law, very early. I think that their success was something that helped the women's movement, and there were leaders of that movement that always worked for women's rights and for gender rights, including sexual and reproductive rights. Other connections to other movements, I think, come because women have been occupying very important roles in the leadership of social organizations. And there are also like the women groups within Patria Grande, the Movimiento Evita, the different big social organizations that were born in the 2002 crisis, and also their connection to the government through different structures of fundings, etc., were very important. But also in the last part of the Cristina Kirchner government, many young women reached lower echelon positions in the government, in the social affairs ministry, etc. And they did and led a lot of feminist work in the barrios, in the suburbs of poor suburbs of Buenos Aires, where they trained lots of young women from these popular neighborhoods. And the adolescents mobilization, I think it's also part of the end of the Kirchner government that have a very strong campaign to bring politics to high school. It was a disputed thing, but one of the issues that was brought to high school, public high schools, was the discussion about sex education. And there were also networks of teachers of sex educations that were connected to different political projects that taught lots of sex education courses that were about feminist ideas and about egalitarian projects in terms of sex equality. So I think that there was a lot of teaching and organizing of the younger people. And as you probably remember, the last mandate, during the last mandate of Cristina Kirchner, they changed the law to authorize adolescents voting since they are 16-year-olds. So that was part of the politicization of younger people of that stage, that I think it's a very important thing too behind the whole mobilization.
And a second part of that question in the chat is, what does this bode for the working with queer movements moving forward on other issues? You've already mentioned gender identity and same-sex marriage and now abortion. What about other issues, including socioeconomic justice issues?
Well, the panorama there is less clear, because I've seen fights or discussions or tensions in the conversation about gender identity, because there are groups that are requiring the elimination of the women, men, female, male categories. And of course, there are women that don't agree with that. There is also a controversy on sexual workers and prostitution, of course, like everywhere, but it's becoming stronger. And of course, it also includes the LGBT and the queer dimensions of that conversation. And last week I was interviewing a leader of the LGBT movement on the enforcement of the gender identity law and problems in that regard. And he was saying that today he doesn't think that the law would have been able to be approved with the support of the women's movement, because of all the conversation about like the gender identity and women's identification or female identification, etc. I don't know if this is too strong a claim, but I certainly see in the social media, which is a small part of reality, of course, at least in Argentina, and a small part of the reality of the elites and the young people advocating with the tweets, etc. I see that there are strong tensions there, and now there are many groups and debates separating feminists on the sex work discussion, etc. And this has happened everywhere. Why wouldn't it happen here? No, that's my impression. At the same time, I think that I start to think that some parts of the claim of Janet Halley about like moving a little bit away of certain forms of feminist conversation are beginning to make sense. It's not, I don't believe on the strong claim about that, but I think that we need to reframe some of our claims and also go to the social justice and economic equality conversations, which are a challenge for us. I also think that feminists in this country we need to think about growth. In a country that haven't been growing for 70 years, we're not going to reduce gender violence, or we're not going to get our rights to substantive equality if we don't think how to enlarge the pie a little bit. It's time for us to grow and to use all this empowerment to occupy places in thinking how this is going to change, how we are going to reverse the 70-year process that we all recognize that has been a failure for everybody and for those that are worst off, and women among them, of course.
So I think we've come to the end of the time, and that is an absolutely great place to leave this conversation. And COVID is, among many other things, an inflection point for movements and social justice advocates in Argentina, but across the world, to think about growth and reframing. So I want to thank Paola for the just extraordinary presentation of how we got to where we are in Argentina and the different strands of threads and tapestry she wove for us. And thank everybody who attended the web meeting, and as well as thanking Maya and CORTH and Sussex for hosting this wonderful conversation. Maya?
Well, thank you. I'm almost speechless because we need a whole day to discuss, all the issues that Paola and has outlined, and you've brought up, Ali, in your conversation together. I mean, it was packed with facts. You covered so much, and there's just so much buzzing in my head, as I'm sure in other people's heads as well. So I just want to say it's been wonderful to hear such an inspiring talk, but also an inspiring story. And it's a story that needs to be told. And I'm so glad that you were able to tell it in our midst, and with the CORTH platform. So thank you so much, both of you. And I want to thank everyone who joined us. And if Paola and Alicia, Sophie, and the co-directors could hang on for a few more minutes in case Zoom allows us, then we would just say a proper goodbye as well. Thanks, everyone.